Hey everyone, I'm Oussama Zaki. You can call me Usa. And today I'm humbled to be here. I like this room actually, it's very cozy, small. I hope we can have a meaningful conversation about agility and architecture through a topic that is dear to my heart. Before we get started, a little bit about myself. I'm into art, engineering, leadership. I'm originally from Morocco, but I lived in different countries across different cultures. Most of my learning and software building skills I've learned at companies like Google, Klarna, Spotify, and currently I'm an engineering manager at Miro. Things I'm currently learning is parenting. I have 2 toddlers. Feature flags, what I'm going to talk about today. So disclaimer, I'm still learning, so I'm really open for a good conversation. Vertical flying, I'm into skydiving, and a little bit of experimentation, async collaboration, and developer experience. There are some topics that I'm really fascinated about. I have no clue how they work, but I just enjoy seeing them in practice, which is data engineering, applied statistics, and AI in the workspace. Okay, a little bit about Miro. Anybody here have heard about Miro, used Miro? Yeah? Oh, okay, cool. It's a conference about agility, so yeah. So I'm not going to go through this, but I would like to go through this. So at Miro, one of the teams that I'm leading is called Iteration Platform Team, and it's a team that looks at iteration-related operational problems, and we try to solve them iteratively. So when I say iteration operations or iteration ops, that includes rollouts, experiments, and the management of underlying feature flagging infrastructure that powers that. And also one of our Miro behavior is called launch fast and iterate. So our team is trying to make everybody at Miro launch fast and iterate. Okay. And what are we going to talk about today? So today we're going to talk about, it's a conference about agility and architecture. And when we talk about agility, we often focus on people, processes, and delivering fast. When we talk about architecture, we often zoom out and we talk about scalability, resilience, long-term sustainability, and things like that. But there is a powerful concept that sits right in the intersection of these both worlds, which is feature flags. Now, if you're thinking, isn't that just an if statement around a feature, right? Well, yes, but also no. At Miro, we use feature flag not to hide unfinished work behind feature flags or to test in production. We actually use them to unlock a completely different way of working, and we're going to talk about that later. So they give engineering teams the agility, right? First keyword, to move fast, test in production, decouple deployments from releases. But at the same time, when implemented thoroughly, they require and reinforce a strong architectural thinking, from flag lifecycle management to performance considerations and to cross-system consistency. And also they make teams think about their features or their block of work as an isolated model so we can actually flag it and turn it off and on demand. So an example of this at Miro, feature flags were a key enabler behind one of our biggest launches to date. In October last year, we announced over 20 major features, things like data tables, docs, slides, create with AI, and so on. And behind the scene, all of those features were behind feature flags. So you could imagine that every team is working in their own scope. It allowed team to develop those features in parallel, to test in isolation, and to gradually roll out those features at our own pace. So without that level of flagging infrastructure, I think coordinating a launch of that scale would have been chaos, I would say. But thanks to feature flag, it was just a normal day at Miro. We just launched in 20 features, no worries. So today I want to dive deeper into feature flags, not just as a tactical tool, but also as a strategic capability, shaping both the agility of your teams and the architecture of your systems. Among other things, we're going to talk about software delivery, how we can decouple releases from deployments, some impact analysis, some controlled rollouts. We're going to talk about feature flags, right? This is what this session is about, like a little bit of nomenclature, the feature flags in practice, and the trade-offs. We're going to also talk about the iteration practices at Miro. Like now that we've seen feature flag as an infrastructure, we can talk about what you can build on top of it, which what we call at Miro iteration practices, things like dog fooding, beta programs, and gradual rollouts and experiments. OK, so let's start with a little narrative. So let's imagine you have ideas, right? When you're building a product in software, you have multiple ideas. And sometimes ideas, they don't come as new features. Like you're not always shipping new features. Sometimes you're bug fixing. Sometimes you're rebranding. Sometimes you have copy changes. Sometimes you're iterating over features that exist already. So you have all these features, and they have to fit in your product. So we start talking about an ecosystem of coexisting ideas, right? So you have things that already exist, and then you have this new feature that's just going to come out and fit in your whole overall product. And the second visualization is more of like an information architecture to kind of understand like different aspects of a product, how they fit. We have a concept of surface, like some ideas, they share a joint surface. Like, for example, when you look at the board bar, you can have also multiple features there. And so this is just to think about like ideas, they don't, in nature, they don't come in isolation. They fit in a whole ecosystem of things. And when we talk from that perspective, like ideas, might differ, right? There's new stuff, fancy stuff, but there is also like smaller things. But they all share one common aspect, which is impact. It can be positive, it can be negative, it can be planned for, like for the cases of, you're launching a new feature and you plan that this will have a great impact on the user experience or will have a great impact on how people collaborate together in a distributed setup. But sometimes they have negative impact. It could break the whole thing, or it could slow down the user experience, and so on and so on. And that impact can be measured in terms of magnitude, or like from huge to insignificance. Now let's talk about how you deliver that idea. And again, I'm using this keyword idea like as an umbrella for features, whatever new things you're shipping to your customers. So at this stage, your idea, like, when you work on it, it becomes more tangible, more concrete, like most often lines of code, right? And then once you want to deliver that idea, there is the atypical or the typical delivery, actually. Traditionally, your code will just be merged into the main code and then released. And here I use the term released instead of deployed. It was intentional. We usually use them interchangeably, but we shouldn't. There is a difference between deploying code and releasing features to users. And we're going to talk about that later. So with this atypical delivery, things often need to be corrected, right? Remember the impact part. What would you do if the impact is terrible? Right? Like you ship this new functionality and all of a sudden the whole thing is crashing, or you have like big customers complaining about breaking terms of conditions, or like sometimes it's even terrible, like the whole app is broken. So more often you'd need to do a new deployment that mitigate that outage. So you need to dive deeper, bring in a team to look what's wrong, and most often that ends up with a rollback. So you cannot roll back the changes you've done. And you could think about loop as, you're already losing money, but also you're losing trust and so on. But also there is the stress on the team and the chaos and so on. What if there is a way you could actually just say, oh, things are wrong, one click, and things are fine again? And that's what we're going to look into. So that's the part where we decouple the releases from the deploy. Remember the part where I said deploys and releases are different things. So the best concept to help us understand the difference between deploy and release is dead code. Like it exists in the code base, but it's never, like the flow of the app never reaches it. So you can merge and ship your code at your ease. That's what we talk about, deploy. You deploy that artifact, and then the release could come later. And here you could actually decide who you want to release to. It can be decided through a control flow, preferably external of the app to the app, or it could be like part of the app. There is different ways you could do that. And that's where we introduce the feature flags. It comes from this whole, decoupling the deploy from the release. So, for example, if we look at our feature create with AI, like it's literally we have a feature flag that wraps or gates that feature or that deployed code, allowing you to have more control over its release. And then you unlock this powerful or simple thing, which is you can actually turn off or on that feature remotely. So I'm introducing here some like basic illustration, but we're going to build upon them throughout the whole presentation. OK, in practice, I'm going to go back to that if statement. It's literally just an if statement, right? Your code becomes, you have this gate where you could say, OK, now it should be on, now it should be off. But then what can you do with this concept, right? There is this book called Life is What You Make Out of It. And we're going to try to see what we can make out of this concept. So we have this representation of all our users, and we have this new feature for them. And at this stage, it's all off, like nobody's seen this new feature. And at this stage, we could already start talking about continuous deployment, right? Because that feature is never going to be activated for the users. You could actually keep shipping to that feature continuously. You don't have to build up like code and tie the kind of deploy to that code to a release. You could continually ship code, making your iterate or like your continuous integration cycle a little bit shorter. You could merge incomplete features into the main code base without exposing it to the end users. And then the fun part starts. So you could start testing in production. This is my favorite thing. So a lot of people disagree with me at Miro. I'm not sure about you here, but I'm a big fan of testing in production. Because it just gives you the real life example of what could go wrong or what could go really good. But if you do it without a good architecture, without good mechanism, it could turn into a really bad situation. But I love risk. I'm into skydiving. So testing in production is when actually you start activating that dead code or that feature behind a feature flag. So this, you can enable the feature only for yourself or like your team. So you can start testing and validating early if it works as intended, if it integrates well with the part of the whole application or other parts of the system. You could start thinking of an internal release. So basically, this is at Miro, we call it a Miro release. It's a big kind of practice that we use every feature. Since Miro is intended to be used for teams that collaborate a lot and innovate, we kind of use it on a day-to-day basis. I think most of my stack at work is 50% Miro and maybe 20% Visual Studio Code and other systems. So we actually have a good opportunity to test all new features internally and actually see how, if they work well for us, if they give us a boost, then definitely there is potential for our users to benefit from them. So we have this internal releases. Every feature goes through internal releases. So we actually use it. We stress test it. We kind of find edge cases and so on. And you could get early free feedback and iterate before you actually reach users. So that's like kind of our first golden iteration practice, which is dogfooding, but it's just, it's not dogfooding anymore. It's just how we do things. Follow up on that, there is next layer of iteration practices, which is naturally what a common use cases of feature flags is beta programs and segmented rollouts. So here you could see, like in the previous slide, we talked about, well, it's on for myself, and it's on for some users, like some 2 users from my team, and some 2 other users, not in my team, but actually within Miro. When we move on to the next kind of practice, it's more about, you could have segmented users, like you have like a beta cohort, or you have like a country-based cohort, and so on. And that enables you to run private and public betas and control the release of new features to specific user segments. Another practice, which is most people are familiar with, is A/B testing, is achieved through feature flags. And this is where you run controlled experiments, such as A/B test, where group A would get 50% the feature on, and group B would get 50% off. This is also another practice that we use a lot at Miro. It's a bit complicated. We're not a B2C focused company. We work mostly with big enterprises. So it's hard to kind of experiment on that segment of users. What you mostly want to do is, run experiments that are on an org level, so you could actually see how Miro behaves in different organizations given different features. Just a little notes on experiments, like why it's, I'm pretty sure some of you would relate to this, why it's randomly turned off for some people and it's not like distributed intentionally. Any thoughts around that? Like why isn't it this way or that way? Why is it really random? So this is another important part of when we start talking about experiment and the other practices like internal releases or beta programs where you actually know the cohort. In experiments, you have to randomly pick that cohort so you can actually benefit from the experimentation analysis later on. So here users are randomly assigned to each group to compare behaviors and outcome. And this setup helps us determine features effectiveness and informs whether to fully roll out or actually revisit what we're doing and by looking at data-driven insights. Another practice which is we use a lot at Miro, I think this is one of the top used one, which is the gradual rollouts. Usually when you have a new feature, you don't want to hit production, release it to everybody like a bang. What you want to do is start with a small percentage of user. Of course, you've done the internal release, everything is fine, but still, you don't have guarantees that the feature will behave the same way as it behaved internally as in actual users in production. So what you want to do is start by a 5%, look how the feature is doing, look at the overall system, and then increase it by 10%, 25%, and so on and so on. You could really play with that percentage until you reach 100%. Now that we've seen the key practices, I'm going to get back, get back a little bit and talk about feature flags nomenclature. When we talk about feature flags, the term, it's the software development technique. It's the technique itself. We're not talking about implementation. We're not talking about code. We just talk about it as a practice. When we talk about a flag, then here we can actually talk about the actual flag, the code, the config, and the definition of that flag. Then we talk about flag variants. So when typically all the practices that I showed earlier, they rely on an on-off mechanism, right? Like the flag variants here are on or off. But sometimes it's not that simple. Like it's not just on and off. Sometimes you have multiple variants of the same flag or a feature to be deployed and tested simultaneously. We're gonna take a look at that. But before I want to talk about the flag types, in literature you're gonna find different namings or different grouping of flags based on how the expectation of those flags and how you should think about them. At Miro, we separate the flags to two. We talk about iteration flags. Those are short-lived flags to help you gradually roll out new features to a subset of users or experiment, things like A/B test. And in this group of iteration flags, we talk about rollout flags and experimentation flags. And the second type, and in this type, I'm going to go back to the flag variants part. So we talked about introducing a new feature, but what about if you have a feature and you want to actually iterate over it, like you have a next version of it, you want to introduce some improvements, maybe some optimization, or maybe rethink that whole feature. So here you could have version 1 and version 2, and your flag will actually enable that either version 1 or 2 based on how you decide to. So here we talk about a base variant, which is the current state of things. And then we have the variant, the new thing, or the new version of things. Another variant examples here is when we do multivariant testing. So you have multiple variants of your same feature. So you maybe create with AI, but using different models. You have model A, model B, and model C, and you want to test how they behave and how they are performing in production. And then you have the feature flag as a remote config. So basically, you're not only turning off or on things, but you're actually injecting configuration. Like, hey, this feature is on, but also use this API endpoint to achieve what you're trying to achieve. Or this feature is on, but use this WebGL configuration to configure how the canvas is going to be rendered and so on. or this button is on, but use this color to kind of render it and so on. So they could really act as a remote configuration. And all of these, like in the scope of iteration flags, so you decide, you don't hard code how the experience is gonna be, but you actually leave placeholder or config points where you could decide remotely and live how things should be based on what you see, like the data or your strategy or your rollout strategy and so on. The other bucket of flags is operational flags. And these are long-lived flags. They could stay in your system for 2 years, 3 years, and they help you control operational aspects of the system. Like sometimes they act as a kill switch to mitigate risks. Like when there is high load, we want to turn off a part of the system. It's not going to be available anymore. Or sometimes when there is a high load on a DB, you want to switch back to some old DB because the new DB that you're testing, you haven't really thought about scalability or other aspects. So they enable disable features quickly in response to operational issues. And a little, like, they also have like a cost associated to them. Like normally iteration flags, a big part of the success of them is that you have to track the data. Like how many people got on, how many people got off, and you compare some set of metrics. And that costs in terms of data pipelines, metrics compute, and so on. Operational flag, since they live for more than a year, you don't want to be tracking those every time because it's just not necessary. The initial state of the flag, here I'll show an example, is always on until you say, hey, turn off this, we have an issue. So there is no need to actually have any data or analytics pipeline backing it up. Or it's a choice, right? But practically, we tried to kind of track all type of flags at Miro, but it just turned out that operation flag, they just consume too much of that bandwidth. And we don't see really a need for tracking every flag evaluation for this type of flags because we're not really looking at the data. We just need them when things go wrong to be able to just turn off. We talked about iteration flags. We talked about operational flags. There is also another use case of feature flags. We don't particularly use this at Miro. We use different kind of mechanism, which is entitlement and permission flags. So if you think about this mechanism of wrapping a feature behind the if statement, well, you could also use it to manage permissions, right? Before actually giving a user or a subset of users access to a feature, you could check an entitlement. Is this part of their subscription or their plan? Or it could be a permission thing. Are they admin so they can see this feature or not? So that's also another use case of feature flags, but we don't use that at Miro. Okay, we talked about feature flag as this fancy mechanism, enables a lot of fun stuff. You could give you the agility to roll out with more control, with more granularity, the experiments and the powerful tool of experimentation analysis to actually measure if a feature has impact or not, and if that impact is positive. But what about the cost of feature flags? And the great news is that the technique is amazing. It's kind of revolutionary, and it's kind of a core of what we do at Miro, but it comes at a high cost. And that cost shows up in different things. Like the first one is the increased macro complexity. Like your whole ecosystem becomes a tree of decisions. So instead of knowing this is our product, this is the set of features that it has, now it becomes this is our product, but it might have this feature or not. And this customer might have this or not. And then it becomes just exponential. If every feature can be on or off, then every feature have 2 states, right? And then if you have 20 features, that just grows exponentially. But then if you look at the micro level and if you have strong ownership, like for the teams, and this is kind of how we tackle this at Miro, like that macro complexity exists and we're aware of it. But then if you look at it from a micro level, right? Like if you dive into smaller teams, that they have like this small microservice and a small front end that kind of builds a feature, it becomes really small. You can't see that complexity because a team can have 2 to 3 feature flags at the same time. So they're aware of like that trade-off, and and also in the nature of iteration flag, they're not long-term. They're ephemeral. Like you know that that flag is going to be there until your feature becomes stable enough and becomes widely adopted, then you clean up the flag. So we don't see that complexity on a smaller team, but we do see that complexity on a large scale when you look at the system from the big picture. The second part, which is the technical depth. You know, this is yet another piece of code that is not functionality, and there is not a feature, and there is not a core functionality that lives in your code base. So you kind of need a strong strategy on how to clean up those feature flags, because they bring toil. You either need strong automation, like what we have at Miro, like we do have a median lifetime of a flag, and we start knocking at doors for teams. Hey, your flag has been live for 3 months, 6 months. Would you mind cleaning it up? And then the severity of that knocking becomes louder. Like if it's 6 months and you haven't cleaned up, like of course we're not gonna knock. We're just gonna okay. You get the idea. The third part is performance, which is kind of related to that technical depth. You know that you have code that is in production, but is not. You know, as I said earlier, it's not a feature and it's not a core functionality. So if you think in terms of front end, you're still loading that code. So it's more bytes being shipped to the user, and how do you deal with that? And kind of this haven't really been solved at Miro yet. We're still kind of looking at ways we can improve this. We're looking at models for feature flags where you do eager evaluation. So there is a model in feature flags where, in order to decide which flag should be on or off, you just download the whole configuration. Right, like you say, for this feature, it should be on for this users and this user. So what you do, you just bring in that whole definition locally, and then at the moment when you need that decision, so user clicked a button, should we show this feature or not? Then you use that definition to say on or off. But another model would be to actually save that definition remotely and just say when the app loads, say, hey, give me all the features that should be activated for this user. This way, you're not bringing extra code that is not just going to be used to evaluate, but you're only bringing those decisions. There are other things like how often the flag update should be kind of reflected in the app. So currently, as I'm presenting this using Miro, I know that some teams are probably activating a flag or doing some flag stuff. So should it just reload my Miro experience? That's not usually what we want, right? Like I'm in a presentation, all of a sudden it's reloading. Or like you are doing this PI planning or like this massive workshop and all of a sudden things are reloading. You don't want to do that. So you want like really strong update strategies that will not hurt the performance in terms of actual performance of the application, but also the perceived performance in terms of user experience. And there is other things that we're exploring and researching, like flag sets. Only actually evaluate flags that are specific to this surface. And then once the user reaches this part of the flow, then get the other set of flags and so on. OK, the last point, or the one before the last, the consistency across environments. This is something that you could easily mitigate, but we're still struggling with. So there is more of an architecture design choice. Do you want to flag to behave differently in production than in staging, than in your other environments that are non-production? Or do you want the flag to behave similarly in all environments? There is two schools of thoughts that I've seen around this. There is like one flag definition per environment. So you could, in staging, the flag will just behave differently. Like, I don't know, if staging is being used only internally, well, let's just have all flags on. But then some teams would be like, no, that will mess up our work and so on. And there is the other school of thoughts is that there should be one flag definition, which is the production one. And your all other non-production environment, they should just use that one. And there are mechanisms if you want to change the behavior. You could override the flag evaluation for non-production environments because you have that possibility, because it's not a production environment. And the last one is the testing challenges, which is related to kind of all of them. So I'll go back to the example that I said earlier. If you have 20 features and each of those features can be either on and off, then you can think about that decision graph and what is it that you want to test. Do you want to test one feature on, all of the rest off? And then maybe one feature on, the 16 feature on. So it's just exponentially complex. You cannot really test it. One way we do this at Miro is that in our end-to-end test, we disable all feature flags. So we actually test that well, the system behaves in a healthy manner when the feature flags are not enabled. You get a basic experience. And then we start turning on, like teams get interested in different combination of experiences. Like for example, a team wants to test the new design language, how it behaves with some set of features. And then they target those flags, they set them to on, they override the evaluation to be on, and then they test that flow. But still, you can't cover all your possible states of application with tests because it's just exponentially hard. So those are some of the costs that we've seen, and I personally had to deal with when it comes to using feature flags. And some of them are easily mitigated with a good strategy, with a good culture, and some of them are still to be researched. Another thing that comes with feature flag is the responsibility, like who's responsible for feature flags at a big company or a smaller one. And here we kind of find a really nice model with shared ownership and accountability. Yeah, you have a platform team that helps you manage feature flags, that knocks at your door when something is wrong and helps you clean them up and so on. But we need that accountability with the team. So like similarly, when you build some code, you are responsible of shipping it, testing it, and operationalizing it. It's the same thing with feature flags. It's kind of a shared accountability between platform teams and the feature teams. And then another thing that we've saw with feature flag is that you could drive behavioral changes around how a company can iterate. One thing that we've done at Miro is that instead of letting team decide on their rollout strategy with configuring feature flags, we kind of built a golden path of how a feature can go from development until available to all users. And things like internal testing, private beta, public beta, and gradual rollouts are all pre-configured for teams, so they can just go and say, hey, I have now, we're working on data tables, and we have a plan to actually start a Miro release next week, and we're going to leave it for 2 weeks. And then after that, we're going to transition to a public beta, and this is what we're going to be looking for. And after that, we're going to start a 50% rollout to enterprise customers, and so on and so on. So you don't think about feature flag as just code, but it's that behavioral change. Like even engineers, everybody in the team start thinking in terms of iteration practices. Whatever feature you're working on, how do I get it to production in a safe manner, in a data-informed manner, and so on. And then feature flag are not a tool just only for engineers. Like you could also make them used by PMs, analysts, designers, or anybody. Anybody who feel like, hey, now it's time to go public beta are able to do that. So that's something that you want to foster in a team, so you don't have that bottleneck of, if feature flags are just like an engineering thing, it's a configuration, it's a code. No, it's actually, if you abstract the concept enough through a platform or through tooling or anything, like it could be like a whole shared responsibility within a whole team. And that brings us to the conclusion. The feature flags are where the agility meets the architecture. They're not just a deployment trick or a dev team hack per se. They're really a strategic lever. And if you do them right, they'll quietly become one of the most impactful systems in your entire engineering org. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm happy to dig into questions, stories about feature flags if you have any. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And questions, we have a lot. I really need to bring my laptop over here. Thank you. So I'm just starting from the top because people voted the questions. So if you want to have questions asked, because we probably can't do all the 10, then go to Slido and vote. The first one is, how can you use feature flags for non-reversible changes like migrations and database schemas? A classic.
That's a classic question. Actually, we dealt with it last month. Our team does office hours, so we kind of have like booked slot for other teams to come and talk to us about feature flags. And this one use case that came to us last week, there is one team that was migrating from a different DB stack to a new one, and they literally had this question. Like, how can we make sure that, once the flag is turned on, it can never be turned off again? Because, we started writing to a new DB, it just make no sense to go back to the old one. And sometimes the feature flags you have to actually, I wouldn't say, yeah, feature flag, there is a way you could do that. There isn't. It's actually just, how would you think about that if statement? And how would you actually think about, like one way to solve this is actually only evaluate once and cache that results forever. And that's what actually we went for. But actually what we were really interested in, we realized that actually we're not going to use this feature flag to actually turn on and off things, but actually to synchronize. Because one issue that comes from migrating to a DB to another is that you want all, and this was in a distributed setup, so you want all pods or systems to start using the new DB at the same time, at the same timestamp. So you don't have discrepancies where, well, one flow is writing to the old DB, but the second flow is writing to the new one, and then you have this data mismatch where the whole knowledge or that the truth is kind of discrepant and distributed across different DBs. So we used the feature flags actually to synchronize that. So at the same time, we said this flag is now on, so all pods will behave the same way. And we used a caching mechanism where if this flag was evaluated once, never evaluate again. So we went on the same path. And then, sometimes this is where the use cases where feature flags can become very dangerous. If you use them wrong, in a wrong manner, you could end up in, data being corrupted because it's written to two different places or two different pieces of, like 50% of the data is one place and the other 50% is another. Mm-hmm. So the actual answer for this is a good conversation of with the team that is trying to do this and kind of mapping out what could go wrong and how we can mitigate it.
Okay, cool, thanks. The next question, did you build all the feature flagging infrastructure in-house, or did you take something off the shelf? And if it's in-house, did you open source anything?
Yeah, thanks for asking this question. We've done a research 1.5 years ago around build versus buy. And we use a combination of a vendor plus our platform to kind of, so the part that I said about driving behavioral changes. We've been using a vendor, Split.io, if you know it, for a while now. And if you look at it, most of the vendors, they give you the tool as bare bone. Like they give you a feature flagging tool. They didn't give you an iteration tool or an experimentation tool. They give you a tool to manage feature flags. And what we realize is that, well, we have a culture around feature flags at Miro. We have practices that are very specific to us that are not captured in the tool. What we find ourselves doing is documenting on top of the tool. So we'll write documentation for internal teams about how to use the tool in a Miro way. So if you want to do a Miro release, the dog fooding part, you go to Split and you configure it this way. Then we realized, why are we even doing this? Like then the tool changes, they change the UI, then you have to go and change your docs. It was not scaling. So what we decided to do is use the tool, the vendor, as infrastructure, like flag storage, flag delivery, and evaluation, and build on top of it. So you could actually capture those elements of culture. Like how we do a Miro release should be a button. You shouldn't be go in and configure things. You should go to a platform and say, hey, you know this feature that exists in this different system? Now it's going to be in a Miro release. And you click that one button, and then it becomes, the configuration behind the scene happens. It's pushed to Split and so on. So a combination of buy and build is what we're settling for. I'm not sure. For now, it's working well for us, but we're always learning and seeing what. There is another issue we found with using vendors is sometimes feature flagging vendors are associated with experiments, and sometimes they are blocked by ad blockers because there is tracking and so on. And we've seen that 95% of our flag evaluation are successful, but sometimes there is a 5% that gets blocked through either firewall from enterprises or ad blockers, as I said, because the domain literally is not Miro.com. It's kind of the vendor. So we don't have control over that, and that creates issues. Sometimes a feature is on for a customer, right? And that customer has 1,000 employees, and then one of them does not have the feature, which is, if you think about Miro in its collaborative nature, you can't have slides for everybody but not one person. Then that would be weird. Like literally, like somebody is like, oh, okay, I'm out of this. So that's one of the issues that we're still seeing. And there are ways we try to mitigate those and so on. But maybe in the future, we will switch to a full in-house build. But for now, we're running with a hybrid method.
Interesting. The next one is also a very good one. How do you handle user manuals and documentation for features that are not visible to some segments of the users?
Yes, that's actually a good question. I think when we talk about rollouts in general, there is always, yeah, I mean, of course you're using feature flags, but there is always communication on when those features are going to be released to customers. Because someone might see this created with AI and start talking about it in social media. And then another customer can come in and be like, hi, why don't I have that? Or like another user. So you have like you need a really strong communication strategy about new features that are coming in, either through major events where you announce things and you say, over the next 2 months, it's going to start shipping. And sometimes it can even be very precise, as in saying, over the next 2 weeks, you're going to start seeing this feature. So not exactly on this Monday it's going to start being available, but in case of gradual rollout, you could say, over the next 2 weeks, you might get access to this feature. So it's really about communication intentionally and with full transparency, not saying, because you never have that date where it's going to be 100% live for everybody. There is always a gradual rollout nature of things, and you need to communicate around that in a very transparent and honest way.
Okay, cool. And the next one, how can you identify all code snippets that need the same feature flag related to the same change if they are spread throughout the system?
Yeah, that's the most annoying part about feature flags, is that, like when you say it's a door, but then not all features are actually one room. Some features are like just like design systems, for example. There is a button here and there, but it's the same button. Or like there is iconography or colors and these kind of things. Sometimes we talk about and usually what you want with the flag is to be evaluated where it's going to be used. So you can have accurate tracking. When you say this user has been exposed to this feature, it needs to be accurate, as in because you base your whole analysis on it. So we try as best as we can to kind of advise teams to, that's the part that I actually mentioned earlier, which is it forces you to think about a good architecture for your features, to build them in isolation. So if you want the perfect case is that once the flag is on, all your feature is activated. But that's not the reality, right? Sometimes features are all over the place. Like as I gave the example of design language, what you do is that you evaluate a flag somewhere where it's going to be used the first time and kind of reuse that treatment or that variant. You could cache it, you don't reevaluate again, and say now, when Miro has loaded, everywhere where there is a button, it should use this variant, and so on. So there are techniques how you could actually not only have that local evaluation that enable things, but you could actually say it beforehand. For this session, use this version of the server, and so on. So, and you know that every usage of that is going to refer to that treatment. There is different ways to implement this based on the stack that you're using or the nature of the app or the product and so on. But it is possible, and we have to deal with this kind of often. There is another example of this is when you have a feature that activates across the whole stack. So you have the front end, but then there is also the back end. And the back end can only work if the front end has that feature on. Sometimes you could use headers to propagate, or what you want to do is actually use the same context to evaluate. And when I say the context is when we decide if a feature should be on or off, you actually decide on a user or an organization or a plan or a language or a region and so on. You want that context to be the same for front end and back end, so the evaluation could be consistent. So if we either evaluate in the front end or back end, it's going to be the same on or off.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I would take a break here. And it's also lunch break. Please evaluate the session. There's a lot of questions left, so I hope you stay here a little bit for people to ask you. So
yes,
yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.